Project Healthy Minds, you guys encourage the conversation around the mental health crisis and the importance truly in vulnerability. And I think one of the things I love most about you guys is that the model really starts with the media and the influence that we can make the change happen, right? So I wanted to start off the conversation today around discussing the history behind how being open and honest is vital for our humanity's growth and feeling we are never alone, how it allows us to open up and relate to another person and start to feel grounded within ourselves. So can you talk to us about one of the first moments in media that started to open up the gateway around the impact and vulnerability?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And I'll tell you, Haley, when I started this work, and we'll get into it in a little bit, but when I started this work, I realized that what we were trying to do in the mental health space in terms of changing public attitudes around mental health, destigmatizing the issue, bringing an issue that for too long had been relegated to dark corners where people whisper, and we wanted to bring it out into the bright light. That really what we were trying to do, it probably wasn't the first time in American history or global history that people had been sitting around a table talking about an issue that was taboo, that was stigmatized, that they wanted to bring out into the light. And so I was like, you know what, if we're going to be working on this issue, we got to be students of history here. And so I was like, okay, well, like what would be good examples? And I went back in American history, try to figure out like, okay, what are good examples from like the last 60, 70 years? Things that we can learn from other fights, other taboo issue areas where public figures were coming out, were leading with vulnerability and were sharing their story and it was impacting others. And it was interesting. What I found was pretty interesting. You can trace the history of sort of this sort of advocacy back at least to Betty Ford, 1974, at a time when, I'll be honest in saying, I did not realize until this work that when my parents grew up, when many people's parents were growing up in America, cancer was highly stigmatized. It was called the Big C. People did not talk about it publicly. And if you go back to 1974, you had Betty Ford, who came out about her own breast cancer at a time when people didn't, and got a mastectomy at a time when people did not get mastectomies and did not talk about getting mastectomies. And if you read the press coverage from the time, New York Times, Time Magazine, all kinds of press coverage, what you see is skyrocketing rates across the country and actually around the world of women getting breast cancer screenings as a result of Betty Ford being vulnerable and talking about her own breast cancer and getting a mastectomy. And you can draw a line from Betty Ford in 1974 on the issue of breast cancer across the last 50 years to other issues as well, like Magic Johnson and HIV/AIDS, right? And finding role models in the community. Magic was at the height of his career when he came out about his HIV status. And for millions of people across the country, it played a massive role in bringing the issue out into the spotlight in ways that it hadn't. But you can draw that line from Betty Ford on breast cancer and Magic on HIV all the way through a couple other issues too, right? You think about the LGBTQ issue, right? For so long, people have been closeted and unwilling to share their truth publicly. And what was interesting is I was digging into the research on it. This obviously predates my own life, but one of the things that you find is until Ellen DeGeneres and her show Ellen, until she came out at the end of the episode, until that point, LGBTQ characters had really been portrayed in popular media as tragic characters, right? It was always the character who was going through some major issue. And really, Ellen was like the first hero archetype of somebody who was the hero and could be gay. And that those two things could coexist just as often as any other issue around. And so you can draw a line from Betty Ford on breast cancer to Magic Johnson on HIV/AIDS to Ellen on LGBTQ rights to Katie Couric in 2000 got a colonoscopy live on air on the Today Show after she lost her husband to colon cancer.
Which is just like bow down to that, like bow
seriously.
Down.
I could only imagine. And like, what's interesting is scientists then coined a term afterward called the Katie Couric effect. Katie Couric effect was after she did her colonoscopy live on air, you saw a significant rise in the number of people who were getting colonoscopies across the country. That increase is still maintained today. So you can draw a line, from all of these issues through a Melissa Milano and Me Too, even to Logic's 1-800 song, which is really the basis of the work that we're doing now, that was organized around bringing mental health out of the shadows. So to answer your question, Haley, on the question of the role of vulnerability, at the core of all of these examples, you have the same dynamic. You have public figures, people that the rest of us look up to, who demonstrate through the power of their vulnerability, the ability to reshape the public discourse and bring issues that we all face out into the limelight so that people can actually bring their whole selves to work and to their everyday life, or to talk about the things that are impacting us that we need to be talking about.
The first thing that comes to my mind is education is key. And until you are presented with something, you don't know what's different. And it's amazing to see that through that timeline, we've had so many people who have been able to champion their own struggles publicly by saying, I know that in hopes it's going to at least help one person. And in fact, it did. It helped so many people. I know the Logic song, I know your history with Project Healthy Minds and how the nonprofit started. And I know that Logic had a really good example for you in wanting to kind of turn your business skills into something more purposeful to the change that we can make by breaking the stigma. But I've never asked you this question before. What really of the song related to you personally? Did you hear the song and then all of a sudden you were like, maybe this relates back to something that I'm dealing with or something that I know is dealing with? Or did you sort of see the media outreach and pour that kind of came with the song?
Yeah, well, at the time, this was 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, maybe even at this point, 2017.
Pandemic year doesn't count.
I know, it's like I don't know whether to count that or not anymore.
It's gone.
But this was 4 years ago, and Haley, we're similar ages, and so I don't know if we go through the exact same things, but there are some shared things that I think everybody in their 20s sort of goes through. And
millennial babies.
Yeah, exactly. And I had been observing that basically everybody seemed to be going through the same shit, no matter where you lived or what industry you were in. You go through this process post-college of individuation, right? Where you move to a city, you could be working in advertising or finance in New York, you could be working in politics in DC, you could be working entertainment in LA, you could be working in Silicon Valley on technology startups. But pretty much everybody that I was talking to, all my friends and everyone that I knew, were going through basically the same life experience at the same time. They were basically working really long hours. They weren't finding much fulfillment in their work. If you ask people, do you want to be the 50-year-old that runs your department one day? Do you want to have that person's life? 9 times out of 10, they're like, absolutely not. I do not want that person's life at all. And so many people, if you ask them, like, have you stayed in touch with person X or person Y? More and more often people are like, oh, no, I wish I did. But like, I've done a terrible job at that. And I don't know what's happening with Jake Levy, And at the core of a lot of that conversation, whether people use the term explicitly mental health or not, is really a mental health conversation. They're talking about a sense of belonging and community. When they talk about being stressed out or burned out at work, they're really talking at the core of all of this about their own mental health. And so when I heard the song, and I was just thinking about it as someone who loves hip hop music, and I was really moved by how powerful Logic's story was as a biracial guy from Gaithersburg, Maryland, sharing his story publicly and how his own identity and sense of belonging intersects with his own mental health journey. But then when I heard some of the stats about the impact that the song was having, and I thought about everything that I was going through and all my friends were going through, and pretty much everyone my age that I knew was going through, I was like, these things have to relate in some way. And so, yeah, it impacted me personally, because to me, it was reflecting back, like all good music does. It reflects back the lived experiences of people and helps shape culture as an amalgamation of our lived experiences.
I think it's so important to see the influence we have actually to make change in the public eye. And I think right now more than ever, it is completely vital we showcase speaking up for ourselves when needed most.